Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for tonight's Nutshell discussion. My name is Katie Adams, and I am the Illinois Demonstration Farm Manager here at the Savanna Institute. We are a nonprofit organization based out of Wisconsin and Illinois, focused on agroforestry research and education. We truly believe that widespread agroforestry can help restore soils, build resilience, sink carbon, and support strong economies of cooperation between farmers, researchers, and perennial industry builders. We host on-farm field days, offer print and online resources focused on key agroforestry practices, land access and lease structures, and the basis of establishing tree crops, which are all available for free on our website. And we're also building a network of demonstration farms across central Illinois and southern Wisconsin, and are currently recruiting mentor farms as well as applicants for our second year of the Agroforestry Apprenticeship Program. During this evening's discussion, if you're joining us from a computer, I want to invite you all to share your questions and comments on the chat box of the platform. I will monitor them throughout the nutshell and make sure to address them during the Q&A session at the end. If you're joining us by phone, I'll give you instructions on how to ask Keefe a question after his presentation. So now on to the main event. We are honored to welcome our presenter for the evening, Keefe Keely. Keefe is the co-executive director of the Savanna Institute, where he helps lead research and education efforts. He is joining us tonight from his home in Madison. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Keefe to get things started. It's so great to have you on the line, and give us 1 second while I switch over the presenters. Keefe, can you hear me?
Yes, hello.
Hi, welcome.
Good evening, hello. Well, thank you, Katie, for hosting this tonight, and thank you to everyone who's here joining for the webinar. This is the first time that I've given a nutshell webinar here, so I'm excited to have the opportunity. And like Katie said, I intend to leave some time at the discussion for discussion at the end of this, so hopefully you can stick around until that, and hopefully I can contain my excitement for agroforestry and get through all of the things I want to tell you about, so we have some time to do that. My topic today is the power and opportunity of agroforestry, and I'll get right into it. First, I want to tell you about where I come from. I come from southwestern Wisconsin, and this is a picture not from when I was growing up, but from the 1930s, so sometime before I was growing up there. But this is during the Dust Bowl era, when land degradation was pretty severe throughout the country. Southwest Wisconsin, if you don't know it, is a hilly part of the Midwest, and so there's special challenges with erosion and flooding. And agroforestry, although it wasn't called that at the time, was a part of the Soil Conservation Services, or Soil Erosion Service, it was called then, and now the Natural Resource Conservation Service, part of the efforts to address what was a really critical problem in agriculture and in whole communities that were getting covered in mud at that time. So planting trees in agricultural systems and across the landscape was a part of the suite of solutions that was developed. And the reason I start here is because while we still have some pretty severe problems with erosion, they're not as bad as they could be, and we've managed to make them better. And so to me, that's a note of hope that largely these problems are of our own creation, and within the confines of not getting beyond certain tipping points, we have the power to change the situation here. And so our situation right now is pretty grim, although, like I say, it could be worse. Globally, we're exceeding planetary boundaries in several dimensions. Loss of diversity, over-nutrification of our ecosystems, and of course climate change. Agriculture has an important role in how human activity is pushing us beyond these planetary boundaries, and that's at the global scale. Of course, all agriculture is local, and agriculture is an important problem in local resource degradation as well. And many of the common approaches to address these problems make agriculture less bad, to be a little bit frank, but they don't really make agriculture a force for restoring those landscapes and the ecosystems there. And what we really need is a transformative solution, and that's what agroforestry offers, is rather than just making our annual monocultures a little less bad by putting some buffers on them or trying to cover the bare soil in between the crops, agroforestry is a way to transform the whole system to one that's perennial, based on woody plants and herbaceous perennials. It's polyculture of multiple different species, integrated livestock we'll talk about, and importantly, it's a closed system, which means that we're not reliant as much upon inputs that we're putting into the system, many of which are based on fossil fuels, but it's the ecological function of the system itself that does many of the things that are the reason why we put inputs like fertilizers and pesticides into agricultural systems. And so this is another figure that shows what I mean by that. A closed system, which is that rather than losing our nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, and losing soil and sending toxins into the environment, diversified perennial systems have deeper roots that are in the soil all year round. They stabilize the soil so we don't get as much erosion, and they're better at capturing those nutrients so we don't lose them into our waterways. And there's less need for the toxins that can become a severe problem for many communities coming off of agricultural areas. Agroforestry is really a science and a practice and an art and a tradition that allows us to do that. And the USDA has codified agroforestry in this country, the US anyway, into 5 practices: forest farming, silvopasture, alley cropping, riparian forest buffers, and windbreaks. And I'm not going to go through all of these practices in detail. This figure comes from the National Agroforestry Center, which I'll mention now and again is a great resource for learning about agroforestry. And you can find fact sheets about all these practices from them. Savanna Institute also has lots of good information about these practices. And yeah, I'm not going to get into them all tonight, but we'll give you some taste of what agroforestry is all about. Agroforestry is not, as is commonly thought, sometimes dealing with Ents, which are tree creatures from the Lord of the Rings, but rather dealing with Ints. We talk about the 4 Ints in agroforestry: intentional combinations of trees with crops and livestock, intensive management of land, fertility, grazing. It's really the intensive management that's important there. That it's not just different things together in the same place, but that those things have relationships with each other. Trees and livestock and forage and crops have relationships and are designed to work together. And then that system is integrated for the farm to function and be productive, but also integrated with the ecosystem and community values that are important. So that's agroforestry in the 4 Ints. Like we talked about, the parts are integrated. Silvopasture, like we said, is one part of agroforestry, and that involves integrating the tree component with the forage and the livestock. So they're not just haphazardly in the same place at the same time, but working together. 2 approaches to agroforestry fundamentally are to put trees into agricultural fields or to introduce more agricultural practice into trees. And one unified concept for agroforestry is that it's one system, but there's many options or practices that can be adapted to a certain situation and a certain set of objectives depending on where you are and what you want to do. But in all cases, it's some combination of trees with crops and or livestock. And this is, again, a nice figure from a scientific paper, but adapted by the National Agroforestry Center. And they put out a wonderful publication a couple years ago, Enhancing Resilience in a Changing Climate, and all about what agroforestry can do to help agricultural systems become more resilient. This is really one of the golden concepts of agroforestry called land equivalent ratio. And the key here is that we can do more on less land because different crops and livestock, when integrated, take up different niches or allocate resources differently. And so the trees might have deeper roots and the agriculture might have more shallow roots, for example. And so a land equivalent ratio of 1.4 means we can get what would take 1.4 acres of land worth of production if agriculture and trees were separate. And by putting them together, we can get that much production in just 1 acre of land. So that's really a powerful opportunity that agroforestry represents. Is it can actually make our agriculture more productive, in addition to many other benefits that we look to agroforestry for. And it, like I said, it can really be adapted to many different situations and objectives. And so we sometimes call it the Swiss Army knife of agriculture, because it can do so many things for us. One of the key things that agroforestry can do for us, it's hopefully becoming widely, we're becoming more widely aware just how critical it is that we not only curb our emissions severely so as to mitigate a runaway climate chaos, but that we also do everything in our power to draw carbon down out of the atmosphere. And there's no technology that's more effective and more proven than photosynthesis to take carbon out of the atmosphere and put it into biological systems and the soil. And trees are awfully good at it. And so it turns out, surprise, surprise, when we add trees to our agricultural systems, it results in a lot more carbon being taken out of the atmosphere. And the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, other scientific bodies, scientific publications, research publications are increasingly recognizing that agroforestry is in the top tier of solutions that we might look to in order to get more carbon out of the atmosphere. And I won't go into this figure in detail. We can talk about it in the Q&A if anyone would like. Here's another figure I won't go into in detail, but this was a study that looked at globally what's the amount of carbon that's sequestered in biomass, which is to say living plant tissues, on farmland globally. And the red represents areas where there's very little carbon stored in biomass. And the darker blue, you can see in many tropical areas where agroforestry is common, they store a lot of carbon in the biomass of their farming systems. And this is just biomass. Soil has the capacity, of course, to hold a lot of carbon. And there are many studies that show when trees are part of the farming systems, it also enhances the ability of soil to absorb carbon more rapidly and more durably for longer. And so these red areas, which of course is where we are here in the U.S., represent a lot of opportunity to store more carbon in our farmland. This is a chart from Project Drawdown, which still exists. They did this study a few years ago and looked across all climate change solutions globally, what had the greatest potential to reduce carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And you can see it's a wide range of things from refrigerant management to wind turbines to reduced food waste. Silvopasture was the top, which again, agroforestry, trees with livestock, the only agricultural solution in the top 10. They also had alley cropping and forest farming and other ways of integrating trees further down the list. If they had put agroforestry all together into one solution, I don't know where it would have landed on this, but it may have been even higher. So this is not just a marginal thing that we can do, but this could really move the needle on climate change. And so there's the power and opportunity of agroforestry for you. Water quality, I think, needs to, there are many other things we need to keep our eye on while we're going full speed on trying to curb climate change, and water quality is one of them. Nothing does better than the deeper roots and perennial vegetation, which is the hallmark of agroforestry. There are many other things we could talk about here: wildlife conservation and biodiversity, pollinators, rural development, and the human element. I don't have time to get into that tonight. I do want to recognize, as we start to ask the question of how do we get there, Wendell Berry said, if we don't know where we come from, we'll have a hard time saying where we're going. And I think it's important to recognize that even though we have all this scientific research, agroforestry is not simply something that some PhDs invented to solve climate change, but that around the world, including in the U.S., the indigenous food systems that existed for millennia were basically agroforestry. They may not use that word to describe them, but trees are an important part of agricultural systems, of traditional food systems throughout the world. And so it's a process of colonialism where those food systems were erased and moved on along with people that we need to recognize as we think about how do we restore our land and communities, that there's something we can learn from in people who adapted their food systems and land use over millennia. And this is, the photograph here is from Spain, the Dehesa. This is a traditional indigenous food system there where they raise oak trees, the acorns feed the hogs, cattle also graze on the grass, the cork is harvested from the bark of the trees, and it's been there for thousands of years. And so in places where there was not the same kind of colonial process that erased the traditional food systems, agroforestry is more common. And so, again, I think that's an important lesson for us to learn as we look forward into the future as well. That dimension of time is especially important for agroforestry because in contrast to annual systems where you essentially hit reset every year, tree crops get bigger and more mature over time, and the harvest cycles are very different. And when we're integrating multiple crops together, it takes a fair bit of planning over decadal timescales to do that effectively. And this is a great figure I like from one of the infographics we produced at the Savanna Institute that shows over time we can change the cropping in the alleys between trees, and as the shade starts to become more mature, graduate into an entirely perennial system like silvopasture, or even harvesting hay between those trees, and start to harvest the trees as well. And so the common question, and it's a good one, is, well, what about the shade when we're integrating trees, and doesn't that take away from our crops? And yes, it does at some point, but we can plan for that, and there are some crops that are more complementary with the shade that gets cast by trees. Some of the trees that we're most interested in for the Midwest and wide-scale agroforestry systems in the Midwest include hazelnut and chestnut. And I won't get into the details. We've had other nutshells, and we have lots of great resources if you want to learn more about these crops and all the good work that's being done to develop them. But what's worth noting is that the reason we grow soybeans and corn in the Midwest is not because people particularly like eating those things, but that those are sources of protein and oil and carbohydrates. And like soybeans, hazelnuts are rich in proteins and oils, and like corn, chestnuts are rich in carbohydrates. And so while there's a long way to go before we're able to have functional commodity replacements with tree crops for our row crops, it's within the realm of what's possible and what we're working towards, certainly. Oh, excuse me. I believe I just lost the screen. There we go. So just to help frame a little bit of thinking around why we're interested in hazelnuts and chestnuts, we believe that in this x-axis scale of, on this end, ecological resilience and climate solutions and improving water quality and human health, and on this end of degrading resources and communities, which largely annual crops in the Midwest are doing. You know, forestry does a good job of this, for example, but it's low-value commodity markets. And we think that hazelnuts and chestnuts and agroforestry can potentially be start out as high-value specialty markets, and indeed already are, but that we can continue to move these into larger commodity markets as we go and maintain some of the ecological resilience that is important in what we're trying to do. Oh, and I want to thank Sarah Lovell at the Center for Agroforestry at the University of Missouri for that figure. Another great resource if you want to learn more about agroforestry, the Center for Agroforestry at the University of Missouri. And while we've talked a lot about the ecological benefits of agroforestry, it's worth noting that there's a profit potential as well. And not only in the high-value specialty crop market, but this was a study that our colleague Kevin Woles did a couple years ago where he looked at both growing corn and growing black walnut in monocultures, respectively, which is to say either all corn or all black walnut, and compared that to what was the profit potential of growing those two things together. And everywhere that you see the bright colors on this map, profit was greater when growing those two things together compared to either of growing them separately by themselves. And so again, this gets back to the land equivalent ratio of if we can walk and chew gum at the same time and grow crops and trees in the same place, it can earn more money for farmers. So that's one area of agroforestry development, is just recognizing where it's actually more profitable. Of course, because of all the public benefits, there's appropriately public support available to establish agroforestry on private lands. And that public support mainly comes through the Natural Resource Conservation Service. And there are many programs that can become somewhat confusing as alphabet soup, frankly. But the bottom line is Uncle Sam will pay for your trees. And so if that's something that you would like to take advantage of, head to your local conservation office and tell them that's what you want to do. And they may say, we don't really do agroforestry here, but sometimes it takes a little bit of education and talking to somebody else in a neighboring county that has already done it, or a little bit of exploration. But in many cases, there are programs available. They are vastly underused, which is to say many public dollars which are allocated to planting trees and could be used for that don't get spent on that, and instead get spent on other things that have less benefit to the public and frankly to the farmers. So I encourage you to explore that, and these, while it's a bureaucracy and it does change slowly at some points, we've been a part of this at Savanna Institute, and NRCS is very eager to have more public input and demand for these programs. So even if it turns into a headache for you, just you going into that office or picking up the phone and saying, I want to find out what support there is for agroforestry on my land, that sends a signal to them that there's demand for those programs and they develop them further. Again, thinking through time is important with agroforestry, and as we've set our mission to really shift the way agriculture is done in a widespread fashion across the Midwest, we've had to be somewhat strategic about thinking what's accomplishable within our lifetimes. And as Wes Jackson said, if you're only thinking about what you can accomplish in your lifetime, then you're not thinking big enough. So we're going as fast as we can, but recognize that fundamental changes will take some time. And so, again, I won't go through this slide in detail, but this is our reference point and where we think agriculture can change over time. So I have a lot of slides here about what the Savanna Institute is doing. I'm just going to kind of buzz through them. I did have a video to show, but when we tested that out beforehand, it doesn't go through the webinar platform very effectively. If you would like to see the new Savanna Institute video, stay tuned. It should come out within the next few weeks in our newsletter or on our website. But for now, you'll just have to listen to me go through more slides. So this is our mission and vision diagram for the Savanna Institute. Our mission is to catalyze the development and adoption of resilient, scalable agroforestry. We do that through three main programs, which are tree crops, farming systems, and stakeholders. And within these pillars, we have multiple programs, but it's really about developing the trees, the actual crops that are the building blocks of agroforestry system, about stitching how those tree crops are grown into ecological systems that are economically resilient and competitive. And then stakeholders is a big umbrella for all the people that it takes to move agriculture. And our programs span a lot of those different stakeholder groups. And really what we're working towards in all of that is a multifunctional agriculture that's based on agroforestry systems that integrate trees, crops, and livestock and foster ecological resilience, climate stability, economic prosperity, and vibrant communities. Again, we're going to skip the video, but stay tuned for that. I mentioned our work on hazelnuts and chestnuts. you can see we released this past year an impact investment plan for hazelnuts that details how we see the industry in the Midwest unfolding in the years ahead. And we're working right now on a similar plan for chestnuts. This is a mechanical chestnut harvester you see in the photograph here. We, as Katie mentioned, are developing a network of demonstration farms, and Katie's been leading that charge in Illinois. These are some photographs and figures from a demonstration farm that we put in at Silverwood Park in southern Wisconsin. This past year, 18 acres of chestnut and elderberry and black walnut and hybrid poplar. Primarily, these are 80-foot alleyways where soybeans were grown last year, and will continue to grow annual crops in those alleys in the years ahead. Being at a public park, this is a great opportunity for public education and to see agroforestry in action at a commercial scale. So I invite you to come visit us there this year ahead. Here you can see where we have our demonstration farms in 2020 and plans for more in the years to come. Encourage you to connect with Katie if you'd like to learn more about the demonstration farms in Illinois. We do a lot of work on silvopasture, and including research and education. Encourage you to check out our resources on that, as well as many other activities that we have documented about agroforestry, about people who've adopted agroforestry, about people working in partnership with others. We have templates for long-term leases, many different educational building blocks for expanding agroforestry in the Midwest. And as Katie mentioned at the top, we are building out our apprenticeship program further this year, adding new host farms and apprentices. We're seeking applications for both of those parties right now, so I encourage you to inquire about that if you might be interested in being an apprentice or hosting an apprentice at your farm or supporting that program otherwise. We're also hiring several new positions right now, and so I am a little bit biased, but I think we have a really amazing team working on this mission, and we're excited to add more people to it. So if you're interested in that, I encourage you to check out those positions on our website and drop me a line if you'd like to learn more, or just send us in your application. And extend my thanks to all the team that makes all our good work possible. And also my thanks to our wider community. Those of you listening in, if this vision is compelling to you, I encourage you to be in touch, and there's something for everyone to do. So, so please join us as we help agroforestry take root in the Midwest. And I want to thank all the many supporters, many different kinds, that have supported us thus far. And with that, I end the formal presentation and look forward to having a little discussion if people would like to discuss.
Thanks so much, Keith. We had a question just come up. Michael asked, Keith, could you talk about the marketing aspect for chestnuts and hazelnuts? Are they mostly local, national, or international markets?
So marketing for hazelnuts specifically is local, national, or international. All of the above. Most of the hazelnuts grown in the Midwest right now are marketed locally. And there's a company in Gays Mills, Wisconsin called the American Hazelnut Company that's a grower-owned business that buys and processes hazelnuts into oil and flour. It's a small company, just got started a few years ago. But most of the hazelnuts grown in the U.S., 90+% of them are grown in the Willamette Valley of Oregon. And that's large-scale commercial growing and processing. And we're working with some of the people out there to learn from what they're doing. And we've working with folks at the University of Wisconsin, Jason Fischbach and others, to bring some of the processing equipment from Oregon so that we're able to develop markets here. Also, the harvesting equipment is an important part of having hazelnuts harvested at a scale where we can access those larger national and international markets. But it's a growing market. Like I mentioned, our investment report showed that it's an $8 billion market internationally, on track to grow to double within the next decade. and roughly 70% of the world's hazelnuts are grown in Turkey, and there have been increasing signs of instability in hazelnut production there, including relying on refugee labor and child labor in where the human conditions are not up to par, and so the markets are starting to respond to that. And so that's where we'd like to go, is first to develop the high-value local markets for hazelnuts, and then as acreage expands in the Midwest and we get more efficient at it, we'll be able to access some of those international markets. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and could you talk a little bit about the unmet demand for chestnuts as well?
Yes, thank you, Katie. So chestnuts are a little further along in terms of market development than hazelnuts in the Midwest. As Tom Wall, who's an experienced chestnut grower in Iowa, says, the problem with chestnuts is not marketing them, it's rationing them. And Tom likes to brag, although I think it's true, I know it's true, that and he has a pick-your-own operation, and so his customers will drive, some of them from hundreds of miles, to pay him to pick his chestnuts up off the ground. And there are other chestnut marketing co-ops in Iowa and Michigan and Ohio that buy chestnuts, and all of them could sell many more chestnuts if only there were growers for them. So there's very strong demand for chestnuts regionally. Internationally, it's also a growing market, but we're a long ways from being able to saturate local markets in chestnuts. So there's a very strong market drive there.
Thanks so much. Morgan asks, where is the best place to find tree, shrub, and herb stock in the Illinois area? Which I might be able to answer. But Keefe, if you want to speak to that more broadly about sourcing plant material. And the second follow-up question in that, is it better to start from seed?
Yeah, that's a great question. It really does depend crop by crop. And so where's the best nursery to get one crop? Say hazelnuts would be very different than where it would be to get chestnuts. In some cases, many nurseries do have multiple crops, of course, but they have their specialties as well. One might specialize in berries, another might specialize in nuts and hardwoods. And as far as whether to buy from a nursery or start from seed, it also really depends on the crop and really depends on what your application of it is and what scale you're planning to do it at. Many crops that are grown for commercial purposes do best when you have some sort of vegetatively propagated source, which is to say, like an apple tree is a common example of something that's grafted, because if you grow an apple from seed, you don't know what exactly kind of apple you're going to get, and markets can be kind of particular about what kind of apple they want to buy from you. So it's like that with many tree crops, and there are different ways of vegetative propagation, from some things like currants and elderberry, where you can just take a stick and put it in the ground and it'll grow its own roots, all the way to trees that need to be grafted, some that can be grown through micropropagation and tissue culture, and so it really depends crop by crop. So maybe, Katie, if you're willing and able, you can talk to Morgan more about what crops specifically she's interested in growing in Illinois and where she might be able to find some of those.
Yeah, Morgan, I'll follow up with you on that, about specifically sourcing in Illinois. So, Keefe, what is one thing that you're really excited about this year for the Savanna Institute, or more generally, the agroforestry movement?
That's a good question. What would I boil it down to one thing?
Or one thing that gets you really, really, really excited? Or
yeah. Well, I know maybe it's, I should think of something more positive, but it is positive, really. So the community I come from in southwest Wisconsin is the Kickapoo Valley, and it's very flood prone. And it's devastated communities there. We've had to move entire downtowns of different villages throughout the valley. And that flooding is really made worse by farming that doesn't incorporate perennial vegetation. And so working with some of my local communities, there's growing recognition that agroforestry, along with grazing and orchards and other perennial agriculture, represents a real way to improve the flood resilience. And so we're going to be out in Coon Valley in June, meeting with communities there. They were hit by a really horrible flood in the fall of 2018 now, but still recovering from that. And talking to people there and revisiting some of the history of the Soil Conservation Service and the historic work there as the nation's first watershed demonstration. And so that's really what excites me, is that agroforestry is it's more than just a feel-good thing, but it's a way for farmers to build diversity and resilience on their farms, and a way for communities to build more resilience against flooding and other extreme weather events that are coming along with our changing climate.
Michael just typed in that you mentioned a cooperative for chestnuts. Has your group noticed a particularly helpful role of cooperatives in supporting agroforestry adoption?
Yeah, the chestnut cooperative in Iowa is it's actually not technically not a cooperative. I believe Route 9 co-op, Chestnut Co-op, is the one in Ohio. The Prairie Grove chestnuts in Iowa is it's a grower-owned business, but whether it's a grower-owned business or cooperative, it is really important that farmers learn from each other, and that's a great way for farmers to both pool their knowledge and learn from each other, and also have more economic power, frankly, to be able to work at a scale beyond an individual farm. And so especially agroforestry adoption, which can take multiple years to start to bear fruit, having connections with people who are further along, who've been doing it for years, co-ops and other farmer networks are really important for that. So that's one thing I really appreciate that Savanna Institute, when it's able to do it, is connect people to those farmer networks.
And just to add one thing, especially among young farmers here in the Midwest and beyond, there is a big interest in cooperative growing and cooperative land ownership. And agroforestry can have a huge role to play in that, especially when it comes to being able to order supplies in bulk, be able to share equipment for things like mechanical harvesting, as well as processing and marketing. So I feel like as farming trends are shifting amongst young farmers, I think that definitely can be huge for agroforestry as well. If you have any last burning questions, please feel free to drop them in the box. Keefe, I have a question about carbon sequestration. One of the things that I've gotten a lot of questions of from farmers and other folks that I interact with is there detailed information on finding out how much carbon your planting could sink? Or is that a more complex question than one simple number?
Yeah, that is a complex question. It's a great question. It's one of the things I hope that our research capabilities, as they grow, is able to do. There are models. We know what different species of trees are able to do in terms of sequestering carbon in different conditions with different growth rates, but we don't have off-the-shelf ready way to measure that farm by farm. So I think, yeah, that's something we're working on, so stay tuned. But the demonstration farms that we're planting is going to be a great place for us to test those methods and be ready to roll them out onto more farms.
Kat asks, what's the typical arc of an agroforestry farm that can't obviously start with all the crops in a single season? So what might that establishment and rollout look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. Like I said, that planning for the time sequence over years is really important. I guess this is a good place for me to note that agroforestry planning is really important, and it's best done within the context of a whole farm plan, which there's lots of different frameworks for. Holistic resource management, for example. It doesn't really matter what your framework is, but a plan that starts with what are your goals and what's your situation, what's your place, and what are the resources there, and works from there is really important. And once you answer those questions, what are my goals and what am I starting with, then a lot of the other questions become easier to answer. I will say when it comes to starting with agroforestry, there's, I think, two principles that are helpful to keep in mind. One is some trees do take a long time to grow, but they're still very worth growing. And so starting with stuff that takes the longest can be one valuable place to start. At the same time, some of those things that take the longest also take the longest to start making any money, which is an important part of many farms. So also starting with what are you going to do to cash flow in the early years, and that might be some types of livestock can provide more cash flow. Maybe it's annual crops that you're growing in the alleyways between the trees, or off-farm income. But starting with what's going to take the longest, and where do I want to get to ultimately, and then how am I going to cash flow in the meantime can kind of help set the arc for you.
Thanks, Keefe. Hannah Patrick asks, are you working with any farms that have transitioned to a phase where they are harvesting trees for timber? She's interested in hearing more about the transition from food production to producing for the timber market. Is it difficult to sell timber if it is only a small number of trees?
Yes, it can be difficult to sell timber if it's only a small number of trees. There are some exceptions to that if they're very high value trees. Black walnut veneer logs, for example, can be at maturity worth thousands of dollars each, and so it only takes a small harvest for it to be worth a harvest. But for many timber markets, volume is very important. However, there are niche markets for timber. One great example of an agroforestry system in southeastern Wisconsin, it was sheep was their primary livestock, and primarily they were a sheep farm, but they were growing in agroforestry systems and both doing pasture and cutting hay between the rows of trees. And they grew hybrid poplar and red oak primarily, although other things as well. And the red oak was their timber tree, so that's a long rotation. But the hybrid poplar grown around them helped those oak trees grow up straight long trunks so that it was good timber form, which is important for the value there. They harvested the poplar and chopped it up into little bundles of firewood that they sold at a nearby state park where there was a campground, and they sold them at the roadside too for campers who were driving by on the way to the state park. And that was actually a pretty lucrative cash flow for them. Hybrid poplar grows very fast, and for camp firewood, you don't need real high quality firewood. So they were able to bundle up a lot of firewood, and at $5 or $10 a pop, it adds up pretty quick. So if there are niche markets, if you have small numbers of trees, it really depends on where you're at and what you're able to do to access those markets.
And there are folks that do run custom mills, depending on where you're at, that might be willing to travel for smaller amounts than a large-scale timber would be.
Yeah, I will add that while I think that growing for trees for timber is important, and there's a lot of opportunities to do that integrated with agricultural systems, a lot of the focus for us at the Savanna Institute has been on developing trees for food and trees that have a function for livestock, so providing shade or shelter or supplementary forage for livestock. And really thinking about, I think the National Agroforestry Center calls them working trees, is really important. And many times, like the example I gave, those working trees can also be a sort of nurse crop to help your timber trees, which take longer to grow and develop straight and valuable.
Morgan asks, are there resources for navigating water management with NRCS? And I would add beyond as well.
Yes, there certainly are. And water management is a pretty big topic. But I think, yeah, so NRCS is a great place to start for many things, including water management. And depending on what you're doing on your farm, they may be able to, help you either restore some of the hydrology or redirect some of the water if you need to, or get more water to drier areas on your farm, which in most of the Midwest in the last few years hasn't been a problem, but 2012, when we had our last big drought, was not that long ago, at least in my part of the world. And so yes, I would encourage you to reach out to NRCS and local conservation folks in your county and area. I will add that, and this is true beyond water management, but it becomes important here, is that a lot of our agricultural systems are based on adapting the land to what we want to grow. And I really think it's important that we flip that script and think about how do we adapt what we want to grow to the land. And farming is all about meeting in the middle for figuring that out. How do we get what we need while also working with the land? But for example, with water management, we might conventionally think about putting in drainage tile to get the land drier so that we can plow it. But maybe a crop like elderberry, which is naturally grows in riparian areas and is tolerant of wetter soils, would be a great opportunity there. And elderberry is a crop that I didn't bring up in the presentation, but there are thriving markets for that in the Midwest, and a growing number of growers and new grower co-ops popping up from Minnesota to Missouri. So I'll say that about water management too. That start with the NRCS, but also one of the opportunities with agroforestry is to be able to think beyond the box and diversify what we're doing so that it's a better fit for the landscape.
Thank you so much, Keith. That question of how do we adapt what we want to grow to the land is so key in so much of the work that we do. Well, it looks like we don't have any more questions coming through the chat box. So Keefe, I just want to thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your work with us tonight. And thank you everyone for joining us. We have recorded the discussion, and after a week or so, we'll have the recording up on YouTube. And I will send everyone the link as well as Keith's slides after the presentation. And then also, I will be including a link to the evaluation. It just takes 2 minutes, and it's really helpful feedback on how we can improve the discussions and shape them to what you want to see from the Savanna Institute. And Keith mentioned that we are hiring, and there's one hiring round that closes on the 17th, which is only 6 days away. So if you're especially interested in working with me here in Illinois on the demo farms, I'd love to see your application. So Keith, once again, thank you so much, and have a wonderful night.